Hi folks, welcome to another episode of My Life with Robert Burns. Jim Thompson and Douglas Mackenzie here again to talk to you about another of our cronies from around the Burns world. Hi Jim, how are you doing?
Doing great, Douglas. Hi everybody.
Oh Jim, we've got a serious job tonight to introduce this crony. Folks, over 20 years ago, Jim Gibson had the foresight to record some interviews with some Wheel Kent Burnsians of the time. A bit like a forerunner of this My Life with Robert Burns. I think Jim showed us the way. He held on to these videos. Unfortunately, we were able to get them converted into a digital format. Neil Mackenzie of Keep It Creative managed to use his techie knowledge to convert them. So we've got a few videos of people from the past that we'd like to share with you. Cronies everywhere. Our guest tonight is the former president of the Ayrshire Association of Burns Clubs and the organiser and chairman of what could be described as the first modern iteration of the Bachelors Club, and a well-loved Burnsian wherever he went. When I was president of the Ayrshire Association of Burns Clubs, I was lucky enough to have Joe Kennedy as my vice president. His Burns scholarship and his wise counsel, his great sense of humour and his warm friendship were a fantastic support to me during that time as president. However, Jim Thompson knew Joe even better than me. So I'd like to pass over to Jim to tell you a little bit about Joe Kennedy before we start the film.
I was introduced to Joe Kennedy in 1996 by Jim Haslett, another great Burnsian who has now passed. And I immediately warmed to this humble and extremely decent man. Within a few months of knowing him, we became close friends. And it was a friendship that I cherished until his death in 2015. Joe had worked as a railway inspector, and then his heart began to fail him. And as a result, he was given light duties, and he was given a job as a signalman at the signal box in Hurlford. I would often go down there of an evening when he was on the back shift, and basically we just sat for an hour or two talking about Burns, his works, his songs, but more importantly for Joe, his letters. He was a huge fan of the letters, and his knowledge of them was encyclopedic, to say the least. Having said all that, he was a great speaker, and his immortal memory and his toast to the lassies was always well received. At club nights, his tales of the Tartan Army and his anecdotes of his Burns travels left the place ringing with laughter. He was also a former referee in the junior leagues of Scotland and a linesman as well. And he spent many Saturdays when I knew him at Scottish League games as the guest of one or two of Scotland's best known football referees. I felt then, as I feel now, that I was privileged to know this man and to be in his company. I would pick him up to attend Burns events and Burns suppers, and I picked him up principally because you couldn't let Joe drive after dark o'clock. It was a journey he didn't want to make. But that meant we spent a considerable amount of time together, and I gained a great deal of personal knowledge of the man, information that others were not aware of. And he also provided me with great support, I have to say, and guidance when I lost my granddaughter, because he had been unfortunate enough to experience the loss of a child. In early January 2015, his wife Susan phoned me. It was a Sunday, or a Saturday. I was out for a walk, and she phoned me to ask me if I could go in and see him on the Sunday evening. And this was unusual. I usually went in during the day to see him when he was in the hospital and leave the evening for family. And she says, no, he wants to see you. And I went away in to see him. And it was at that fateful meeting for me that he told me that time was running out for him, that the end was coming, and he was wanting a couple of favours from me. And he asked me that if I could assist with the organisation of his funeral, to support Susan where possible, firstly, and then to get the people he wanted. He wanted Jimmy Gibson to speak at the funeral, and he wanted Joe McGinty, a great pal of Joe's, to sing certain songs which he named, and then he wanted me to do a eulogy. And then he advised me very, very closely exactly what I was to say in this eulogy, because, you know, this modest and humble man did not want a fanfare, and he didn't want, and I'll quote you here, a greeting match. He wanted a celebration of a life well lived. The finishing instruction he gave me, I found rather strange at the time, but he turned out to be right again, as he usually was in life. And his final instruction was for me to tell a story about him and his refereeing career in junior football in Scotland. Now, for those of you who know the story, I do not apologise for repeating it now, because for me, it's extremely worthwhile. Joe was refereeing a Cumnock Auchinleck Talbot game at Townhead Park in Cumnock, and he was running up and down the line nearest, as he was the senior referee, it was nearest the stand, and he was continually getting barracked by a gentleman standing, an older gentleman, a man in his 60s, standing behind him, and every time Joe blew something that didn't agree with the man behind him, Joe was getting pelters about being an idiot, being blind, and all the usual stuff you talk about referees and go to Specsavers and all that kind of stuff. And Joe eventually became frustrated. And when the half-time whistle blew, he turned around to this guy and says, "Listen, sir, I'm going to tell you something." He says, "You're in here and you're paying to get in." He says, "I'm here to run the line and I'm getting paid. How does that suit you?" And the guy says, "I wouldn't be too cocky. I'm the club treasurer." Joe Kennedy, at his very best, apparently a semi-true story. However, Joe Kennedy, I would say, was a true gentleman, and long may his tribe prosper.
Again, thanks, Jim. Well, folks, we're just going to show you the film, which was recorded by Jimmy Gibson, and the interview was done by Jimmy Gibson. Joe Kennedy telling us about his life with Robert Burns.
On every
And the Junior Vice President of the Ayrshire Association. He is also a passionate Burnsian like myself. Joe, it's nice to be here to talk to you about your favourite subject, which is that of Burns. And can I say to you, you'll be on the same tape here as Phil Todd and Bill Morrison, so you couldn't be in better company.
I better be my best behaviour.
Now, what I would like to start with, Joe, is, as we have done with the other two, is if you could first of all tell us about your early childhood in Kilmarnock, your early life, education, etc.
Well, I was born and bred in Kilmarnock, Jim. I was born in Sturrock Street, where we lived with my grandparents, and then we moved to Shortleys, and I remember that to this day. I'd be about 3 or 4 years of age. And we moved to a tenement building where we shared with our grandparents, and we moved to Shortleys to this great big council house with a bathroom and a kitchen and everything. I can remember that, moving down to Shortleys at that time. In those days there was no Belfield. We were in Treeswood Head Road, looking right across the countryside. And I loved it down there, my childhood in Shortleys. Big council house and stage scheme, but we backed right onto the country, and thoroughly enjoyed my childhood down there.
We're both from that end of the town, because I remember moving from the depths of Willock Street in Rickerson to the prefabs at Kirkstyle.
Oh, aye.
And what has always remained in my mind was the smell of fresh, sweet air.
That's right.
I'll never ever forget that.
Coming down for Craigie and round.
That's right. So you certainly, round about Shortleys, there were plenty of wide open spaces.
Oh, aye.
Plenty of places for exploration.
It's a great place to grow up.
That's right. So you enjoyed that?
I did indeed, as far as council schemes go, aye.
Now, Burns plays a huge part in your life now. Were you sort of exposed to Burns in those days at school?
Not at school, no, we never got much Burns at school. My mother was Scottish, Jim, and my father was Irish. So that's why I turned out a bit of a moral, actually. And what I can remember in my early life as a child, my father died young, unfortunately, but we kept in touch with a lot of Irish uncles. And there was also another wing of the family married in to Irishmen, you know. And I can remember the great house parties we had in those days. These weren't the drunken parties like what some people have just now. It would be relatives would get together after a wedding or a silver wedding, or sometimes even after a funeral. And we would all have sort of sing-songs, the Irish side and the Scottish side. And you would hear the great old songs getting sung, like the Rose of Tralee and the Mountains of Mourne. And the Scots side would sing, there would be Burns songs among them. The Bonnie Lass of Ballochmyle and Sweet Afton and all that sort of stuff. And I remember that at that time, but I didn't come on to Burns too much later than that actually. But I can still remember these old songs getting sung with my mother and uncles and cousins and things like that, you know. So it was always there.
That obviously started it off. Now, I know you've been back to Ireland once or twice on holiday, and you tell a lovely story about one of the local pubs you were in across in over there.
There was a pub in Sligo, and well, there's actually two pubs. There's a pub in Sligo I was in one night, and I was lucky enough to land in Sligo just when they were coming to the end of the W.B. Yeats Festival. Well, W.B. Yeats is held as much reverence in Ireland as we hold Burns here in Scotland. And there was a W.B. Yeats sort of appreciation night on, there was songs getting sung, some of his poetry was getting recited. And a chap heard the Scots voice and he asked me, was I a W.B. Yeats man, and what was I doing in Sligo? We're actually only passing through, my wife and I were going further down, south on holiday. And I got up, I was asked to do something, as people were all around the pub, sitting with the usual pint of Guinness. And I got up and done a wee talk about Burns and recited to a moose, and the Irish people loved it, they really did, they loved it. And I often wonder if it was maybe time that the Federation was starting to maybe make moves to get in touch with other literary societies, because over in Ireland it's tremendous. And in a place called Westport in County Mayo, there's a Matt, I forgot his second name, he was one of the, I believe he was one of the chieftains. He's got a pub in Westport in County Mayo. And every time I go to that area I always drop into this pub, and it's all with the Irish traditional music's always going. Matt Malloy is his name, sorry. And sometimes you'll get Matt Malloy himself in there and singing the great Irish songs. And I've been in there too, and would you believe it's in there as well? I have recited and spoke a bit of Burns in there.
Great. An international aspect of Burns.
Oh yes,
obviously.
right.
There's another story you tell as well, which I find quite funny, about asking for a pint of Guinness.
Oh, that's the typical sayings that the Irish have. And the first time I took Susan to Ireland, it was Tipperary. The town of Tipperary was the first time it happened. We had just arrived in Ireland, we had driven down into Tipperary, and Susan's a great thing for going around these wee gift shops. I just can't be bothered with it. So I done my duty, I went in 2 or 3 wee shops, and I thought, right, I'm going in that pub there for a pint of Guinness. Now when you've done your shopping, you'll get me in there and we'll have a pub lunch. So in I went, I says to the chap, pint of Guinness please. Certainly sir, is it for yourself now? And I'm looking about, and I'm saying, aye, it's for myself, aye. And I kept wondering if Susan had come in behind me, somebody else came in behind me. And we left there and we moved on down to Arklow, which is County Wicklow. And we got checked into a bed and breakfast place that night, and I went across to the pub again. And I said, pint of Guinness please. Is it for yourself now? And I can't convince there was somebody following me about, but it's just the great Irish way of talking again. These are the kind of things they say. Is it for yourself now?
Yeah.
And I think what he means is he's making it a special, even if it's for me.
Yeah. Now, you're obviously up to your neck now in Burns, without a doubt. That I've watched, I've known you now for several years, known you well for several years, and I've watched your passion increase and grow. In fact, I'm a bit green with envy, because I consider myself to have quite a good knowledge of Burns, and I feel that you've overtaken me now, Joe.
No, I don't know about that.
So with the amount of reading you've done. But anyway, I think the first time I really met you was when you came along to a committee meeting of Kilmarnock Burns Club, and but could you tell us when you first got involved in Burns?
Well, I worked in Massey Ferguson's. That's the first time I met the great Willie Morrison. Willie worked in Massey Ferguson as well. And I can remember Willie sitting in the Weldon office, as it was. Willie was a clerk in there. And quite often the night shift, Willie would be sitting reading a Burns book during the quiet periods. At that time I read a bit of Burns as well, Jim. Not to any great extent though. But on the night shift you would take a book with you. I was a forklift driver in Massey Ferguson's, and once you had done all your machine men started and put their stuff into them, you were maybe sitting for a while with nothing to do. So I would take a Burns book with me to work in the night shift. And I would also take a Burns book with me on holiday, wherever Susan and I went. But it was never to any great extent until 1980. Massey Ferguson's closed down. And I went back on the railway. I'd been a railwayman before. And I went back on the railway as a signalman. And I don't know whether it was divine intervention or not, but the first box they sent me to take charge of was Mauchline, signal box. And you'd be driving into Mauchline, going to work in the morning. You'd have the Jean Armour homes on your right-hand side as you drove in. And you would have the monument, and you would turn down Jean Armour Drive. And you would turn down past the Kirkyard and the Cowgate. And you saw these places. And after 5 o'clock at night in the back shift, to be honest, you were hardly doing anything. All the freight train and the coal traffic out the pit was all by for the day. And you were only passing about a train an hour from 5 o'clock to 10. So you really needed something to read. And I would say that was when I really got stuck into Burns. Going on the back shift one night, I dropped into the library first one afternoon, and I got Hans Hecht's biography of Burns. Took that to work with me. And up until then I had only really read the general stuff like Holy Wally Sprayer, Tam O'Shanter, Epistle to Davy. But after reading Hans Hecht's work in Burns, that really stirred the interest and really got me wanting to know more and more. And fortunately at that type of job, I had all sorts of time to read. And the more I read about his life and his works, the more I wanted to read about the man. And I would say that was when it was. And you couldn't get a better place to read Burns and Mauchline, I don't suppose either. So that was really where I started, I think, Jim.
So like most Ayrshire people, you had a sort of personal interest in Burns, but when did you become involved in the sort of club set-up?
Again, it would be about maybe 1990 before I actually joined the club. And I remember coming out to the Dick Institute with Susan. And I laugh now because every time she says to me, "You're not out in Burns business again," I say, "It's your fault, you started me in this." Well, I came out to the Dick Institute one day at the library and we saw a notice up on the notice board. Kilmarnock number nothing was starting their syllabus for the year. It would be about September or something. And Susan said to me, "Oh look, you've been reading a lot of Burns. There's a Burns club." And she says, "Tonight there's a committee meeting or a recruitment night," whatever it was tonight. So I came home that day, phoned Evelyn Liggett, who was the secretary at the time. Her number was on the notice board. She asked me to come along, and I remember walking over Strawberry Bank down into Toonholm Building Club and joined the club that night, Jim. And I often think it's the best thing I've ever done. I've read Burns and extensively, but you will never appreciate Burns unless you actually go and hear it being spoken by some of the great people we have in Ayrshire speaking about Burns. And that was only a sort of committee meeting, if I remember that night. And I went to their inter-club night in October, and all the great Burns people were there. And then their St Andrew's night and their Burns supper. And I'm very proud and very privileged to be present. I'm the president of Kilmarnock Burns Club. And I'll never forget being elected to be the president, following people like yourself, and looking back through just exactly the role that Kilmarnock Burns Club played in the federation. And it's been a privilege. But at that time they only met 3 times a year, Jim. And much as I enjoyed being a member, I wanted a wee bit more. I wanted to see a wee bit more about the Burns Club scene. And I met Willie Morrison, strangely enough, in Tesco's one day. And Willie was saying, "Oh, I've heard you've got involved in the Burns movement. It's great to see new blood coming in." And I expressed a wee bit disappointment to Willie that Kilmarnock didn't meet just as often as I would like. And Willie said, "Well, just leave that with me, and there's a lot of other things happening that you don't know about." And he phoned me one night, I'll never forget it, what a night that was, and he said, "Busby Hill Burns Club are visiting Kilmore's Burns Club tonight. And the sort of format is Busby Hill Club will go and do the entertainment. It was the Masonic Club in Kilmore's. He said, would you like to come?" This would be about sort of April or something like that. I'd been a member of Kilmarnock Burns Club since the September previous. I said, "Oh, I'd love to, Willie." So Willie picked me up at the house here and took me up to Kilmore's. And I was pretty green. I didn't know what I was going to at all. And I walked in and sat down, and I started arriving. And I just sat there quietly, wondering what was going to go on. And the whole night just started. There was these great Burnsians like Alec Drain, up reciting practically any poem you asked him to. There was Charlie Magorian singing and reciting. There was Donald Perry reciting the Holy Fair from start to finish and explaining every verse on the way through. Danny Black was singing, Tom Strachan, and the one and only Phil Todd, a man who I held with great reverence, as you know, Jimmy. And there's a really funny story if you'd like to hear it about that night. That was the night it all started for me. I was sitting two along for Phil. There was Phil, Alec Drain and myself sitting in one of these long seats you get in these sort of social clubs. And it was the usual format. Phil was doing these wonderful talks in between each turn, you know, and he was inviting his members to get up and do a wee bit. And he reached over and he says to me, "I bet you're a Burns man, sir. Well, you know the format of these things. There's a wee break for tea and biscuits and tea and scones and things. And then you carry on." He said, "You're a bit of a Burns man, sir." I said, "Well, a wee bit, aye." "Well, get yourself ready then. I'm going to get you up to do something." I said, "Oh, no, Phil, I'm not ready for anything like that." Meaning that it might take weeks to get my confidence up. I said, "Oh, Phil, I'm not ready for anything like that." "Ah, well, all right then," he says. "I'll pick you on in the second half." And I said to Alec Drain, "What do you do here?" So Alec Drain says, "Come with me." And he took me down the stair into the public bar of the Masonic Club. And we had 2 or 3 glasses of Black Label, which we've had many times together since then, Alec Drain and I. He says, "Now get back up the stair, and when the biggin tells you to get up on your feet, get up on your feet and do something." So I stood up on my feet that night, and I think I stuttered through Burns' epistle to Andrew Aiken, his young friend. And that was it. And I joined Busby Hill as well, there in Engine. And it's a club, and I love Kilmarnock Burns Club as well. But Busby Hill is very, very close to my heart. It's a wee club, but it's so rich in talent. And they meet in the wee community centre. You get there, and everybody brings some sandwiches or some biscuits. They set up their own bar, they make their own tea. Everything gets cleared away at the interval and they carry on again. And it's just a great club of companionship and camaraderie and unity that exists among Busby Hill. I've often said if Burns was to come back today, he would join Busby Hill Burns Club.
I'm sure you would. I've been there myself, Joe, and I've enjoyed it thoroughly. And I've heard the quality of the recitation that comes from all the members, and some are well over 90 and still do very well. Now, you obviously hold Phil Todd in reverence, as we all do. I mean, Phil, I've heard on several occasions. I've heard academics speaking in Burns, and as far as I'm concerned, and I think you are too, that Phil could hold his own against any of these academics up in Glasgow. That his knowledge and his knowledge of Burns is second to none, isn't it?
Yeah, when he speaks about it, I could sit and listen to Phil just speaking about Burns. I go and visit him now and again, many an afternoon, and just sit and chatting to the man. It's a great experience just sitting and talking to him.
He speaks with a real passion.
Oh, he really does. He really does. No doubt about that.
He certainly in the past interviews we've done. I mean, the comment made by Bill Morrison about Burns doesn't come from the head, it comes from the heart.
Right.
And in both of these previous interviews, once the two of them relaxed into the interview, it was coming all the way from the heart.
Certainly does.
Every
Certainly
time.
does.
In fact, I found it almost moves you to tears.
Oh, it does.
When you hear just how they go on.
And the opposite applies. If you ever hear somebody at a Burns supper getting up to recite Burns, straight out their head, it's just not worth listening to.
That's right. That's right.
It just doesn't come over right at all.
That's right.
It certainly doesn't.
I often consider that we're extremely fortunate here because we take people like Phil and Bill and the others for granted.
Oh, we certainly do.
But we're in a very sort of unique situation. We're in the heart of Burns with real Burns people that feel for the poet.
Oh, we do. We do.
And it's all around us.
These people, they're so steeped in it, Jimmy, and when you hear them speaking or reciting Burns, and I just hold the two of them and sit high like that.
Great. Now, you mentioned one or two songs and poems already, Joe, and then there's a vast array that we know. And I know you're very extremely well read in Burns. You've read the poetry, you've read the letters. Do you have a particular favourite poem or song of Burns?
I don't have a particular favourite. I have favourites out of each aspect of his work, if you know what I mean. As you go through his life and check the age he was when he wrote each poem, or the subject that he's writing on, that tends to fascinate me. When you think that he wrote about Handsome Nell, he was only 15, and when he was 17, when he was sent to Hugh Rogers Private School for to complete his education, he was studying mathematics. And he's 17 years of age at that time. And that's the first time he was really away from home. That was even before he went to Irvine. And up until then, he lived a very sheltered life. The farm in Mount Oliphant. And his father, I think, was fairly strict with the family. He never came into contact much with people of his own age, apart from maybe a Sunday when the father would march the family down to the kirk. And here he's away for the first time in this place, Kirkoswald. And he said of Kirkoswald in his commonplace book, "It was here I learned to look unconcernedly in a large tavern bill, and to mix without fear in a drunken squabble." And even his commonplace book is fascinating reading today. And when you pass through Kirkoswald nowadays, you could never believe that anybody could get involved in a drunken squabble. But at that time, of course, Kirkoswald was a notorious smuggling port. And local records, parish records that exist to this day, tell us that the local minister was getting very concerned about the smuggling, drinking, thieving, hooligan behaviour and sexual debauchery that was going on along the Carrick coast at that time. And here's this young man Burns away from home for the first time, and he's in among all this stuff. And I remember passing through Kirkoswald one day and going into Kirkton Jeans for a pint. And there was an old worthy sitting in the corner who was a bit of a Burns man, and him and I got on to talk. And I was saying to him about Kirkoswald in those days, in Burns' days, been notorious for smuggling, drinking, thieving, hooligan behaviour, sexual debauchery. Aye, says, I ken. Betty says, we're much more civilised now, sir. I said, I should hope so. I said, there's no so much smuggling now. He said. And at that time, of course, Burns spied Peggy Thompson over the school wall. She lived right next door to the school. This was the girl who he said upset his trigonometry and crazed the faculties of his mind, so much so that during the last 2 nights of my stay in the country, if sleep had been a mortal sin, I was innocent. He was only 17 when he wrote these words. And for Peggy Thompson, he wrote that most beautiful love poem, Westland Winds, and he takes the joy and the beauty of nature and the joy and the beauty of Bonnie Lassie, and he puts the two together and goes for a summer's night stroll. Peggy dear, the evening's clear, thick flies the skimming swallow, the sky is blue, the fields in view, all fading green and yellow. Then let us stray our gladsome way, and view the charms of nature, the rustling corn, the fruited thorn, and Ilka, happy creature. We'll gently walk and sweetly talk, as the silent moon shines clearly. I'll clasp thy waist and fondly pressed, swear how I love thee dearly. 17 years of age when he wrote this beautiful.
I think that's the point I like to make as well, that people tend to forget what age Burns was when he was writing all the poetry, the Terbolton Malkin period. And they tend to forget, and he's criticised that when he went to Edinburgh, and he was obviously very popular, and he was popular with the ladies. I mean, the guy was only 26, 27 years of age,
Correct, yeah.
a pop star in modern
Sure.
parlance, you
Sure,
know.
yeah.
And you cannot blame a young man for getting involved
Oh,
in his
no.
surroundings at that time.
God, no. Jimmy, let's all be honest, if we get the chances,
Of
Burns
course, of
as
course.
old Bobby Barnes, another great member of Busby Hall, says, he talks about Burns sitting in the cutty stool and how he was criticised, and how he's still criticised to this day. And as Bobby Barnes says, if we all get the same chances, we would have scale somewhere else.
That's true enough. So any other poems that you know?
Oh, there's such a lot.
I've heard you reciting with real passion. The Cotter.
There's such a, well, the Quarter Saturday Night, I mean, I've heard Phil reciting it, and that is one of my favourite poems. And when you think that that poem is criticised by the literary experts and the academics, I've seen that poem been slaughtered by these people, which just tells me all I need to ken about academics.
Do you have a verse in that poem?
Oh, there's so much here. The cheerful supper done with serious face, round the ingle form a circle wide. The sire turns over with patriarchal grace, a big haw Bible, yince his father's pride. His bonnet reverently is laid aside. His lyre haffets wearing thin and bare, those strains that once did sweet in Zion glide. He wills a portion with judicious care, and let us worship God, he says with solemn air. You can just imagine a wee cottage dinner with a family.
That's right. It creates the picture. You
Oh,
can see it.
it just
You can see
he paints a picture in his poetry. Even to a mouse. One night I was at a Burns supper, Jimmy, and I was really, maybe I'm too serious about Burns, people say I am. I was really very angry one night at a Burns supper. I was there doing the immortal memory, and there was a fella there doing the readings, he wasn't a Burns, he was one of the local people, and he had one of these wee mice things that you get out of Woolworths, with a wee airbag thing in the end of it, and it jumps out of the place, you know. And the chairman said, we're now going to have so-and-so reciting To a Mouse. And he was jumping about with this wee mouse. And he was jumping it into people's pint tumblers and whisky things and whizzing it up folks' legs and everything. And the people were killing themselves laughing, which, okay, they're out for a night out, I can appreciate that, but I sat there that night and I thought about Burns and his brother Gilbert ploughing the field at Mauchline. Just a short time after his father died, and his youngest brother John had also died, he had come through with this carry on into Bolton with dear Both Bess. He had been made sit in the cutty stool there. His father had come through all these legal problems and this litigation with McClure, the landlord, which forced Burns to take on Moss Gill Farm. And again, as you said earlier, you made a very good point. At that time he would be about 25, 26 in Mauchline. He was responsible for that farm, his mother, his three sisters, his three brothers, and dear Both Bess. He was responsible for keeping together. And nowadays there was no national assistance. If the farm had fell apart, you were out in your ear. And he sees that moose, it's fascinating. He sees the moose scurrying away in terror when his plough rips up the nest. And he realises just how one turn of fate can change your life forever. And he identifies with the moose because the moose and him were in the same situation. And then, of course, he thinks to himself, well, it's not really that bad for the moose, because it'll scurry away and it'll build another wee nest somewhere. But he couldn't see any better than for his own situation. I don't know whiles but thou may thieve. And he goes on to say about, a daemonic or a thraves, a small request, I'll get a blessing when I leave and never missed. That's actually a quote from the Bible, believe it or not. I found a quote similar to that in the Bible. If you cut us down the corn in the fields, and a piece of corn blows away in the wind, you shall not go and collect it. It shall be for the hungry and the needy. And Burns got that verse out of the Bible, the To a Mouse. I only found that out a few months ago. And what's it? He goes on to say about how the things will get better for the mouse. Prospects drear, and for him, there's not going to be any better, you know.
A wee contentious issue now, Joe, that Peter Westwood, as you well know, is the highly respected editor of the Chronicle and does amazing work.
Mm-hmm.
And he's compiling at the moment, and it's a Burns encyclopedia, a huge thing.
Mm-hmm.
And he's found out amazing information about Burns and the people around about Burns. He was telling me the other day in conversation that 80% of Burns's writing was done in the Dumfries period. 80%. That's including letters, etc. Now, where would you put the real Burns? Just a question that I've been asked before. If you looked at Burns's work, what would you consider to be the real Burns, and where would you place him?
I don't know if I'd like to just pigeonhole each bit in like that at all. 80% of his work was done in Dumfries.
His written work.
Well, he's certainly the last 7 years or so of his life, he was involved with Thompson and Johnson,
Yes.
with the two.
Peter's also including the letters. most
Oh,
of his
it's-
letters were written from that period.
Oh,
you know.
aye.
So letters and songs, etc. But 80%, I mean that is a fact, 80%
Really?
of Burns'
Oh,
written work
that's-
was the Dumfries period.
Mhm.
But people, a lot of people I know, would put Burns, the rebel, Burns, the man of independent mind, etc. All these things surfaced
Mhm.
during the Turbolton and Mauchline
I would say so.
era.
I would say
you
so.
know.
Aye, aye.
Um,
I'm quite surprised to hear that about Dumfries, but he certainly wrote some great stuff in
Yes.
Dumfries. Tam O'Shanter was
Uh-huh.
written in Dumfries, of course.
uh,
It's, which people think was some of his greatest work. And the songs that he wrote that were all worked, reworked or written in Dumfries. And his letters, I mean, some of his letters. I love reading his letters, Jimmy. I love reading his letters. I believe that's where you will learn about Burns, by reading his letters. I would say sit down and read them. And I remember one letter he wrote when he came back to Dumfries. I just can't quite off the top of my head. It may well have been to Alexander Cunningham. I'm not sure who it was to. And I think the last few months in Edinburgh, he realised that the novelty had worn off. He was a novelty. And the landed gentry, I think they'd had enough of him at that time. They had paraded him round these drawing rooms and these gentlemen's clubs. And I think he knew it was time to get back in among his own folk. And he went back and ta'en on the farm at Dumfries. And he wrote, it may well have been Alexander Cunningham, "The trappings and the luxuries of the upper station of life. I have seen a little of them in Edinburgh, and I can live without them. I shall never blush for my own poverty, or the poverty of my country." And when he was building a house
yes.
in Dumfries, when he arrived at Elsland Farm, of course, the farmhouse was lying pretty much derelict. And before he could bring Jean down from Mauchline, he had a lot of work to do. And again he wrote to one of his Edinburgh friends, "I am just now building a house, not a palace to attract the train-attended steps of pride-swollen greatness, but just a plain simple domicile for peace and contentment." No lovely way to describe
Great
your
words,
home.
lovely words. Now we know Burns is a poet, which he undoubtedly is, and he's a great writer of prose and whatever. Would you agree that Burns is more a way of life than just a poet?
Oh, definitely, Joe, definitely. You read poetry, and you close a book, and you put it down. And I remember reading an article in the Daily Record one day by, I think it was Tom Brown. I usually quite enjoy Tom Brown's wee articles in the Daily Record. But in this case he wrote that he couldn't understand why Burns was given this cult-like adulation every year. And he went on to say, after all, he was only a poet. And as I've always said, if Burns was only a poet, Picasso was a painter and decorator, and Big Pavarotti's no a bad chanter. He's much more than only a poet, Jim. You live your life with Burns. I mean, you can go walks in the country and you're thinking about Burns. Something could come out of the television. You look at some of these countries where there's Wayne's lying starving, and something about Burns will come into your mind. And he's not just a poet, it's a way of life for people like ourselves.
That's
I mean,
right. I agree with that totally. Totally. If Burns was here today, what would he be?
I've often thought that. First of all, I thought he'd be a great politician. And then I thought, no, he wouldn't be. Politics would contaminate him. I don't think he would want to be involved with dirty, murky, cold politics. I wondered if he'd be a great trade union leader or something like that. Or, Phil was saying to me one night, he might even have been the moderator of the Church of Scotland. People laugh at that. But when you read about the Christian values that Burns had and his knowledge of the Bible. And I was sitting one night a couple of years ago, and before the great Mother Teresa died, and there was a programme on about the work she'd done out in the fields in India. And I believe Burns would have been involved in that, he would have been involved with that somewhere along the line. Or possibly writing about Mother Teresa and helping her in some way. And the great Bob Geldof, a scruffy, dirty looking pop star. And I could imagine Burns writing songs for him and being right up at the front of the stage along with him, singing Feed the World. He'd be somewhere along those sort of lines, I'm sure.
Television.
A great humanitarian. And some of the stuff he could have wrote if he had lived longer, I'm quite sure it'd have been running in the West End or Broadway for years and years. We were only left with the Jolly Beggars, which I'd loved if he'd stayed and wrote some more musicals and stuff like that. I don't know what it would have been now. It would have been some sort of great humanitarian like Mother Teresa. Bob Geldof or something.
If you could possibly conjure up somebody from Burns's time, not Burns himself, I know you would love to have met Burns, but if you could conjure somebody up from Burns's time who was involved in his life or featured in his poetry, who do you think it might be? Any particular person?
Oh, I think I'd love to have met his father. I think I'd love to have met his father. I know in later life Burns and his father had a wee bit of a fallout. Who didn't have a father? And when you think of his father's life, how he had to face adversity and getting a landscape gardener and the failure of Mount Oliphant and the trouble he had at Loch Lee, and yet he was still, as Burns talks about in the Quarter Saturday Night, and his headstone down at Alloway, even his failings lean to virtue's side, and how he used every penny he could scrape together to make sure that his boys get the education that he didn't get. And he was I think he was a great far-sighted man, Burns' father. He saw the benefit what education could do, and I think we've got to thank William Burns for how Robert Burns turned out. So I'd love to meet his father.
Now I know you're well read in Burns and you know a lot of poetry. What are you working on just now?
Well, the Burns season's coming up, and I'm doing 16 immortal memories actually. I'm actually trying to put an immortal memory together just now. I don't know if I'll have it ready for the Burns season, but I'm trying to build an immortal memory round Burns's epistle to Andrew Aiken, his epistle to his young friend. And what prompted this was a few weeks ago I was at an 18th birthday party. It was a nephew of mine, or a sort of great nephew. It was a cousin's son actually, but he refers to me as uncle. And he was 18 years of age that night. And his father made a wee speech just before the cake got cut about his son. He was going to be leaving home on the Monday to go to university. And this was the first time he was going to be leaving home. And again, I was talking about how Burns was away all the time. I sat there that night. That was the only time it was quiet, because it was one of these discos with flashing lights and one of these half-wits playing that loud electric music. I was wishing to hell it would blow up an electrocution, but never mind. And I was listening to this, his father talking to his son. I had watched this boy growing up. And I thought about the epistle to a young friend and how any young 18-year-old boy, if you could read that to him and give him the advice that Burns gave him about everything. You'll try the world's shin, my dear, my lad, and Andra dear, believe me, you'll find mankind an unco squat and muckle they may grieve ye. We've all been let down at times with mankind, and we've all been thought that we're right, that want our own way, and you don't always get your own way. All your views may come to naught, where every nerve is strained. And then he goes on to advise the boy about the sacred Lough, a wheel place love. Burns got this great blame of being a fornicator. He did make mistakes, let's face it. The sacred Lough, a wheel place love, luxuriantly indulge it, but never tempt the illicit rove, though nothing should divulge it. To catch Dame Fortune's golden smile, assiduous wait upon her, and gather gear by every while, that's justified by honour. Don't go stealing money. Don't go making money by foul means or by undermining your fellow man. If you're making money, it should be justified by honour.
Joe, I'm sure your immortal memory will be superb, and I
Well,
look forward to hearing it. Before we finish tonight, now, as Burnsmen, which we are, we always have an open ear and eye to other poets and other writers, which we do. Now, I know you have an interest in the surfaceman. Could you tell us a bit about him?
Alexander Anderson was a fascinating man. I first found out about this man. I was in Kirkconnell railway station once. We had a problem in the railway, and I was up in Kirkconnell railway station. I think the track was blocked for some reason, and I was out along with other railwaymen trying to get it cleared. And I saw a plaque in the wall. This was a way back. I was quite a young man. And the plaque said something that erected in memory of Alexander Anderson, surfaceman poet. And that was, I think, as much as it said at that time. And I started asking who this man was. And he was a P-way man, which in the railway is really a navvy. These are the guys, Jim, if you're ever sitting in a train and you go by and see a bunch of guys with yellow vests on and picks and shovels. They could be clearing the snow off the line, or levelling the ballast, or cleaning snow for signals, or just shoveling for. And this man, Alexander Anderson, was a P.U.A. navvy, started writing poetry. He wrote Bairnie's Cuddle Doon, which I've heard Bob Scott at Busby Hill reciting many a time. And he educated himself and went right from that level right up to Director of Libraries of Edinburgh University. And when I started researching his life, I dug up all sorts of information. He contributed to the very first Burns Chronicle. I believe he served in the Centenary Committee of Burns's death. And while he was living in Edinburgh, he defended Burns to an old Left minister in an open debate in a public hall in Edinburgh. And I believe he also wrote a poem about Burns. I just couldn't remember any quotes of it just now, but I've got a copy of it there. Peter Westward actually told me that he knew quite a bit about him. And I've got an article coming out in the next Chronicle. I believe Peter is going to publish it about him. Fascinating man. Great similarities between his life and Burns's life, from where he came to where he got to. And it's an inspiration to any young man. You can, if you've got the heart and the spirit, you can get there.
Well, I look forward to your article, Joe. I'm sure it'll be worth reading. It's been a pleasure talking to you tonight, and I wish you many more years enjoying your...
You too, Jim. Thank you very much. Thank you.
There was a lad was born in Kyle and Whitney.
Well, Jim, that was very good, very poignant. Brings back lots of memories listening to Joe.
Gosh, and where it takes place as well, you know, sitting in that living room, I don't know. And I mean, I remember when we organised his last Burns supper, and that's we were sitting in the same place, and well, Jimmy Gibson had organised it, no, but you and I were both there as guests of Joe, and it was it'll go down in memory for me as probably one of my fondest and one of my worst Burns suppers at the same time.
Yeah. So it really just leaves us to say, first of all, thanks to Jimmy Gibson for having that foresight to record these interviews, especially that one with Joe. And thank you for watching and enjoying listening to Joe Kennedy talking about his life with Robert Burns. Thank you.